In 1997, the San Antonio Spurs finished with one of the worst records in the NBA, having won just 20 games for the entire season and finishing second to the last in the Western Conference, only behind the Vancouver Grizzlies. The Spurs were one of the worst teams in the league that season, but in reality, they really weren't. In fact, the Spurs as a roster had one of the strongest teams in the league, led by their superstar in David Robinson, a Spurs team that just won 59 and 62 games respectively in the prior two seasons and making deep runs in the playoffs in each of those. But with the team being riddled by injuries that season, most notably to their two best players, David Robinson and Sean Elliott, Robinson being out for most of the season and only playing in 6 games, the Spurs, they took a gap year, a season where they knew they weren't going to be competing for anything and treated the season as a wash to get their guys healthy and come back ready to compete for a championship the following year. But because the Spurs finished with one of the worst records in the league, they were given one of the highest lottery odds going into the draft lottery to land the number 1 pick. And while the Spurs didn't have the highest odds going into the draft lottery, given they finished with the 3rd worst record in the NBA, they lucked out and hit the ultimate jackpot by not only landing the number 1 pick, but landing a number 1 pick in a draft that featured a generational talent out of Wake Forest, a man that would go on to become a 5-time NBA champion, 2-time MVP winner, 15-time All-Star and All-NBA player, and All-Defensive Team player, and of course, a Hall of Famer. That man being Tim Duncan, who is regarded as the best player in their franchise's history. A team that was already stacked, a contending team, just so happened to land one of the greatest college basketball prospects in over a decade and would lead them to multiple championships over the next 15 years. Since then, we haven't seen anything like this, where one of the best teams in the league became a lottery team in an injury-riddled season and happened to get the number 1 pick in the draft that year. But what if I told you history could finally repeat itself and it could happen once again with the same franchise that was the benefactor of all this all the way back in 1997? How, you might ask? Well, let's talk about it. Of course, as always, if you like this type of content, then be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a video. I would greatly appreciate it, as well, as we are nearing 100,000 subscribers. Now, the post-Tim Duncan era of the Spurs, and really the post-Kawhi era after they traded him away to Toronto, the Spurs, after over 2 decades, had finally started on a path of rebuilding, going younger, taking a step back for a few years to try and build through the draft and give them the highest odds at landing a top pick in the lottery. And during that time, they would double down on this effort by trading away some of their better players that didn't fit their timeline to acquire more future draft capital, most notably trading DeJounte Murray for 3 first-round picks to the Atlanta Hawks, 2 of those being unprotected picks. Now, of course, we all know the Spurs really hit the biggest prize of them all when their tanking efforts really paid off in snagging the number 1 pick in the highly anticipated 2023 draft lottery, which featured one of the greatest prospects since LeBron James in Victor Wembanyama. And while Wemby already looked the part of a superstar in the making and started ascending in that second season, already being selected as an All-Star at the age of 20, and the Spurs already looking ahead of schedule in the early going of the season with the possibility of making the playoffs, things took a bit of a turn when it was announced that Wemby would be sidelined for the rest of the season due to a blood clot in his right shoulder. This, of course, shortly coming after the Spurs made a blockbuster trade to land De'Aaron Fox from the Sacramento Kings. And with Wemby going down, the Spurs having struggled as of late, even before actually Wemby went down, to the point where they are most certainly going to be a lottery team once again. But on top of that, they also have the benefit of owning the Atlanta Hawks pick, which, like I mentioned, is unprotected, meaning they will get that pick no matter where it lands in the draft. Now, while the Hawks are still teetering on the play-in, playoff cusp, and sure, there is a chance they could make it to the postseason and have that pick be a mid-first rounder that they would send to the Spurs, but if I were a betting man, I would say it's more likely than not the Hawks miss the playoffs yet again, and they send that lottery pick to San Antonio, giving the Spurs 2 lottery picks for this upcoming draft, 2 chances at moving up into the top 4, and yes, 2 chances at the Cooper Flag sweepstakes. Now, at the time of this recording, the Spurs, for their own pick, have a 20.3% chance of moving into the top 4 of the lottery, while holding just a 4.5% chance at the number 1 pick. Not the best odds, but also not out of the realm of possibility, especially considering the Hawks got the first pick with even lower odds than the Spurs did last season. However, if you combine their odds with that of the Hawks and where they currently stand, their odds of landing the number 1 pick actually go up to 6.5%, and their chances of moving into the top 4 go up to nearly 30%. Hell, Hell, there is even a remote chance the Spurs could somehow get the number 1 and number 2 pick in this year's draft should their own pick and the Hawks pick move up in the draft lottery. But while the odds of that scenario actually happening are very, very slim, it's also not out of the realm of possibility that the Spurs, between their own pick or the Hawks, could have a shot at adding yet another generational talent to their roster. And here's why. Aside from the obvious of the Spurs being without Wemby for the remainder of the season, the Spurs actually have one of the hardest schedules to close out the year, being in the top 5 in strength of schedule for the remainder of the season, with 16 of their 25 games being against teams above 500, with teams like the Thunder, the Celtics, the Cavs twice, all left on the docket before season's end. Now, of course, the Spurs aren't going to catch teams like the Wizards, the Pelicans, or the Hornets in the Tankathon standings. Those teams are too far below that of where the Spurs are, and none of those teams are just suddenly going to start winning a bunch of games. However, with a tough schedule ahead of them, they could very well fall below a team like the Bulls, which pains me to say as a Bulls fan, or even the Nets and Sixers if the Sixers ever get their act together, which is probably unlikely, but unlike a lot of those other teams, the Sixers are actually still trying to win. So who knows? They could actually move ahead of the Spurs at some point this season. And if the Spurs in their remaining 25 games, they go up against some of the best teams in the league, fall to the 6th worst record in the NBA, well, guess what? They've just bumped their odds up of getting the number 1 pick from 4.5% to 9% and improved their odds of moving into the top 4 to 37.2%. But it gets even better for the Spurs because you know what team also falls in the top 5 in terms of the toughest strength of schedule for the remainder of the season? Yes, that would be the Atlanta Hawks. Now, the Hawks, as they currently stand, have the 11th worst record in the league, and to be clear, they will be making the play-in because the East is just that bad. But failing to make it out of the play-in, and given the fact that they are only 1 game ahead of the Blazers in the standings, a Blazers team that has been on a different trajectory with the way they've been playing post the All-Star break, there is a world where the Blazers could pass the Atlanta Hawks in the overall standings, and the Hawks fall to the 10th spot in pre-lottery odds, exactly where they were last year, which would boost their odds, slightly jumping another percent in getting the number 1 pick and an additional 5% in moving up into the top 4. But look, all in all, the fact that the Spurs have 2 shots at landing the number 1 pick, the fact that Wemby being out for the season will likely see them dropping in the standings even further, and the fact that both of them, both the Hawks and the Spurs, have 2 of the hardest schedules to finish out the year, means the San Antonio Spurs odds are very much in their favor going into the draft lottery. And if the Spurs somehow land Cooper Flagg, or even Dylan Harper or Ace Bailey, but especially Cooper Flagg, the rest of the league better watch out, because you're talking about 2 of the most highly touted prospects the game has seen in recent years, both incredibly young with a ton of upside, both highly skilled bigs that can play on both ends of the floor, and you have a star point guard in De'Aaron Fox to help run the offense and work in the pick and roll, a player that is in the peak of his prime. Forget about it. You're talking about a dynasty in the making for years to come. Again, assuming no injuries, of course, especially in particular with Victor Wembanyama. So, could the Spurs, just like they did in 1997 and more recently in 2023, do it yet again in this upcoming draft and assemble the next iteration of the Twin Towers, going from David Robinson and Tim Duncan to now an even younger Twin Tower duo in Wemby and Cooper Flagg? We'll be finding out soon with the NBA Draft Lottery happening on May 12th. I would love to hear what you guys think, though, and how lethal of a big 3 of Wemby, Fox, and Flagg could be. You let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.